In the autumn of 1860, within a western county of Missouri, still labeled Blackwater on old maps, 9 households disappeared over a single harvest season. Not just 9 individuals, but 9 entire families, men, women, children, grandparents, hired laborers, even the dogs that slept beneath the porches. By the time the first killing frost arrived in November, 9 farmsteads stood deserted, their doors swinging open to the wind, meals left half-eaten on tables, cradles still swaying in the drafts, and Bibles open to the very pages being read when whatever occurred took place. The county clerk who first documented this list was himself dead before Christmas. The ledger he kept remained sealed inside a locked cabinet at the Jefferson City State House for over 60 years. When a historian finally forced it open in the 1920s, he discovered a single sheet of paper pinned to the inside cover, written in a trembling hand. On that sheet were 4 words that have never been adequately explained. Before we proceed with the story of Blackwater County, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which state or city you are watching from tonight, because what you are about to hear is the kind of history intentionally buried, and the people who buried it counted on everyone forgetting. The 4 words on that pinned sheet were these: they took them willing. To understand why a county clerk in western Missouri would write those 4 words in a shaking hand before consuming laudanum in a boarding house in Sedalia and dying of the corona, politely termed nervous exhaustion, you must grasp what Blackwater County was in the summer of 1863, and what it had already become by the time the last family vanished. You must understand a particular kind of American darkness that wears no uniform, rides under no flag, yet flourishes in the spaces between flags, when the ordinary rules of neighborliness have been suspended by the larger cruelty of the world. You must understand, in short, what a civil war does to the land and its people when the armies are far away, and the only soldiers you ever encounter are those who knock on your door after midnight. Blackwater County lay along the lower reaches of the Blackwater River, a slow, brown watercourse feeding into the Lamine and from there into the Missouri. The land was good, not the rich river, bottom soil of the lower Mississippi, but rolling prairie cut by timber, with limestone outcrops, clear springs, and enough flat ground between the hills to raise proper crops of hemp, tobacco, and winter wheat. Families had been settling there since the 1830s, most coming up from Kentucky and Tennessee by flatboat and wagon, bringing with them the accents and stubborn Scotch, Irish pride of the Upper South. They brought their ballots and their feuds, their recipes for cornbread and whiskey, their distrust of strangers, and their fierce attachment to kin. They brought a hardness bred into them by 3 generations of clearing timber and breaking sod, and a softness that lived just beneath that hardness, the softness of mothers that emerged at barn raisings, weddings, and burials. That softness would eventually be used against them. By 1860, the census recorded a little over 4,000 souls in the county, scattered across some 600 farms, with 2 small towns at the crossroads and a 3rd settlement down by the river landing, where steamboats had called before the war. The settlement at the landing was named Marlowe's Ferry, after the man who first ran a flatboat across the river in 1834. It was a place of grain warehouses, a blacksmith shop, a general store, and 3 saloons, doing brisk trade in pork, tobacco, hemp, and the rougher commerce that always collects around a river port. Upstream, at the crossroads of the old state road and the military road, stood the county seat, a town called New Salisbury, with a red brick courthouse built in 1851, a jail of hewn stone, a bank, 2 churches, and a line of clapboard storefronts facing the square. Everyone in the county came to New Salisbury at least twice a year. once to pay taxes, and once to attend the fall circuit court. Everyone knew everyone else by sight, if not by name. The families who lived there were not rich. A handful held enslaved people, usually 1 or 2 house servants and a field hand or 2, but most were plain farmers who worked their own land, with their own hands and their own sons. They attended church on Sunday at one of 4 little white, frame meeting houses. They buried their dead in family plots on the back 40. And they trusted their neighbors because they had to. The nearest doctor was 11 miles away in fair weather, 3 days away in bad. If a child took a fever at midnight, you did not wait for the county physician. You rode to the nearest farmhouse and knocked. And the man who opened the door, no matter his politics, no matter how tired he was, no matter what grudge might have stood between your family and his, would take his coat down from its peg and ride back with you through the dark. That trust, that web of small loyalties between neighbors, was the first thing the war destroyed. Missouri in 1863 was not a battlefield in the way Virginia was a battlefield. There were no great armies marching across it in blue and gray lines. There were no Gettysburgs, no anti-items, no long fields of corpses laid out for photographers. Instead, there was something older, more intimate, and far more terrible. A war of neighbors against neighbors. The boy who had kissed your daughter last spring, now riding up your lane with a pistol and a grudge. The man who had helped you raise your barn in '59 now, informing on your husband to the Home Guard. The state had declared for the Union officially. But in the western counties, where the Missouri River bent south and the land reached toward Kansas, loyalties were split clean down the middle of every family and congregation. Brothers rode for opposite sides. Fathers disowned sons. Wives denounced husbands from the pulpit. Old men who had voted Whig Democrat. And no, nothing in their long lives now voted with their rifles, and not always for the side their neighbors expected. Into that broken country came the bushwhackers. They called themselves partisan rangers, guerrillas, or simply boys. The Union called them murderers. They rode in small bands of 10 or 20, armed with revolvers and shotguns, moving through the timber and river bottoms like ghosts. They burned out Union sympathizers, ambushed federal patrols, and lived off the farms of the civilian population, demanding meals, fodder, and horses, and woe to the family that said no. On the other side, the Home Guard and the enrolled Missouri militia, often staffed by men with private scores to settle, rode up the same lanes in blue coats and did much the same work, only with the authority of the state behind them. A farmer in Blackwater County in the summer of '63 might be robbed at breakfast by one armed band, and at supper by another, and neither band would feel any obligation to leave him alive when they finished. In a war where everybody is guilty of something, killing a witness is a small matter of housekeeping. The most famous of the bushwhackers, a lean-faced schoolteacher named William Clark Quantrill, had ridden into the Kansas town of Lawrence on the morning of August 21, 1863, with 450 men at his back. By sunset that same day, 150 unarmed civilians lay dead in the streets, and the entire town center was burning. Every household in Blackwater County knew the story of Lawrence by the first week of September. And every household understood what it meant. The rules, whatever rules there had ever been, were finished. If a man with 400 horsemen could ride into a town of 2,000 and kill men and boys in their nightshirts while their wives watched, then nothing was safe anywhere, no door was thick enough, and no neighbor could be counted on. The federal response to Lawrence came 4 days later, on August 25, in the form of a single piece of paper signed by Brigadier General Thomas Ewing Jr., commanding the district of the border. It was called General Order No. 11. It instructed every person living in the 4 western Missouri counties of Jackson, Cass, Bates, and the northern half of Vernon, with the exception of a narrow strip along the military roads, to abandon their homes within 15 days. They could take what they could carry. Everything else, the order said, would be seized or burned. The purpose, Ewing wrote, was to deny the bushwhackers their base of civilian support by emptying the country of civilians altogether. Families who had lived in those counties for 40 years were given 2 weeks to become refugees. 20,000 people were turned out onto the roads before the first frost, and the country they left behind was known afterward for a generation as the Burnt District. What Ewing did not put in writing, but what every officer under his command understood, was that the 4 named counties were not the only ones where the order would be enforced. In practice, any county within a day's ride of the Kansas line, and any county where guerrilla activity was reported, could be treated the same way at the discretion of local commanders. Blackwater County was not on the official list, but by the middle of September 1863, Blackwater County had a small federal garrison stationed at the county seat, commanded by a captain from Illinois named Josiah Pickering. And Captain Pickering had been given a great deal of discretion indeed. This is the country, and this is the moment in which 9 families disappeared. The first to go was the Hollister family. Ephraim Hollister was 51 years old, a widower with 4 grown children still living at home and 2 grandchildren in a back bedroom. His wife Martha had died of milk sickness in 1858, and he had raised the youngest children alone with the help of his oldest daughter Rebecca, who had been 23 that summer and who already had 2 little ones of her own after her husband had been killed at Wilson's Creek in 61. Ephraim owned 160 acres on the eastern branch of the Blackwater River. A good sound cabin with a stone chimney, a spring house, a smokehouse, a tobacco barn, and a team of Belgian draft horses he had bought at a sale in Boonville the previous spring. He was known in the county as a quiet man, a fair dealer, a Baptist of the stricter sort who did not drink spirits or hold with cursing, and a reliable neighbor who had never turned anyone away from his door. On the morning of September 14, 1863, a man named Asa Crenshaw rode over to the Hollister place to borrow a whetstone for his scythe. Crenshaw was 63, a Methodist lay preacher with a bad limp from a horse accident in his youth, living about 1.25 miles away across the timber. He had known Ephraim Hollister for 22 years. They had helped each other at every harvest since before the war started. They had buried each other's wives. They had shared the last good jug of peach brandy in the county on the 4th of July in 62, sitting on the Hollister porch with their feet up, arguing about the war, until the moon came down behind the trees. When Asa Crenshaw rode into the Hollister yard that morning, the dogs were gone. That was the first thing he noticed. The Hollisters kept 3 hounds and a yellow mongrel that slept on the porch, and none of them came out. The second thing Crenshaw noticed was that the chickens were still in the yard, scratching at the packed earth, and nobody had thrown them corn. Ephraim Hollister threw corn to the chickens every morning before breakfast. It was something you could set a watch by. The third thing Crenshaw noticed as he rode closer was that the front door of the cabin was standing half open, and a gingham apron was caught on the latch, flapping gently in the morning breeze. Crenshaw called out from the yard. When nobody answered, he tied his mule to the hitching post, walked up onto the porch, and stood there for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, listening. The silence coming out of the cabin was the wrong kind of silence. The kind that has a shape to it, the kind a man who has lived his whole life in the country recognizes, the way he recognizes the sound of an approaching storm. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The table was set for breakfast for 7 people. Cornbread sat in the skillet on the hearth, cold now, with a knife beside it. There was a pitcher of buttermilk on the table, curdled and separating in the warm morning air. A fly walking on its rim. 7 plates, 7 tin cups, 7 places laid with knives and spoons, and not one of them had been touched. A half-peeled apple lay on a cutting board at the end of the table, the peel still attached in one long spiral, as though the hand holding the knife had simply put it down and walked away. The back bedroom where Ephraim's daughter Rebecca slept with her 2 children was empty. The bed unmade, the quilt pulled back as if she had risen to answer a call. A child's rag doll lay on the floor with one button eye missing. The loft where the 3 sons slept was empty. A clean shirt folded on the bed, as though somebody had been about to put it on. Out in the yard, the draft horses were still in the barn, and the wagon still under the lean-to. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been broken. There was no blood. No sign of struggle. No track of wagon wheels, leading away other than those that had been there for weeks. The only thing out of place Crenshaw would remember afterward was that the Hollister family Bible, which always sat on a small shelf above the hearth, had been taken down and laid open on the table face, up next to the cornbread skillet. The page it was open to was the 37th Psalm. Fret not thyself because of evildoers, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass, and wither as the green herb. Crenshaw rode to the county seat that same afternoon and reported the Hollisters missing to the sheriff. The sheriff was a tired man named Reuben Vaughn, who had been trying to hold the county together with his bare hands since the war started. He rode out to the Hollister farm the next morning with 2 deputies and found exactly what Crenshaw had described. He wrote a brief report, filed it with the county clerk, looked at the open Bible on the table for a long time, then closed it gently and put it back on its shelf. He walked out of the cabin and stood on the porch in the cool September air, feeling for the first time in his 11 years as a sheriff a fear that had nothing to do with bullets or blades. It was a fear of the absence of sound. It was a fear of 7 place settings untouched, because there was a war on, and because men and women disappeared in Missouri every week in 1863 for 100 different reasons. He did what any sheriff would have done. He put the Hollister case at the back of a drawer and waited to see if anyone came back. Nobody came back. 6 days later, on September 20, the Tillman family was gone. 8 people that time, including a grandmother of 74 who had been bedridden for 3 years with crippling arthritis that made her cry out every time she lifted from one side of the mattress to the other. The Tillman cabin was found exactly as the Hollister cabin had been found. A meal laid out, this time a supper of beans and ham and cornbread gone cold in the pot. Beds unmade, clothes in the press, livestock in the yard hungry but alive. No blood, no track, no sign. And the old grandmother, Eliza Tillman, who had not walked under her own power since the winter of '60, was gone from her bed, the covers turned back, her wooden cane still leaning against the wall. Whoever had taken her had carried her out, so gently that her little glass of laudanum on the bedside table had not even been spilled. 4 days after that, on September 24, the Lamb family vanished. 9 people that time. The Lamb girl, Sarah, had been engaged to marry a boy from the next county over, and her wedding dress was found laid out on her bed, finished, pinned, ready for the final fitting. A small bouquet of pressed flowers, gathered for the wedding, tied with a blue ribbon, sat on the pillow beside the dress. The boy she was to marry, a young farmer named Caleb Renfro from across the river, rode over when he heard the news, and sat on the edge of her bed for 2 hours without moving. When he rode home, he would not speak for 3 days. When he finally spoke, he said Sarah would not have left that dress behind. Not for the devil himself, not for anything on earth. She had been working on it for 7 months. If she had walked out of that cabin and left that dress folded on the bed, then she had not walked out. Somebody had walked her out. And that, Caleb Renfro said, was what he could not live with. 3 weeks later, Caleb Renfro was found hanged in his father's barn. The coroner ruled it a suicide. His father, who had taken the body down at dawn, never entirely agreed. By the 1st of October, Sheriff Vaughn had 3 empty houses on his desk and a growing certainty that whatever was happening was not the work of ordinary bushwhackers. Bushwhackers took horses, food, and revenge. They did not take entire families and leave the horses behind. They did not take grandmothers who could not walk. And they certainly did not take people so quietly that nobody within 3 miles heard a single gunshot or scream. The lamb farm lay within 800 yards of the Crenshaw place, and Asa Crenshaw had been awake the entire night with a sick calf in the barn, and he had heard nothing. No hoofbeats, no voices, no barking dogs, nothing at all except once around 2 in the morning, the faint squeak of a wagon axle passing along the river road, which he had thought at the time was only a neighbor driving home late from town. On October 3, Vaughn rode to the federal garrison at the county seat and asked Captain Josiah Pickering for help. Pickering was a thin man of 34, sharp, featured with a close-cropped beard, an Illinois accent, and a habit of cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a penknife while others spoke. He listened to Vulcan's account of the 3 missing families with an expression of professional concern. He asked quiet questions about the locations of the farms. He asked whether any of the missing families had been known to harbor guerrilla sympathies. When Vaughn said they had not, Pickering nodded thoughtfully, wrote something in a small leather notebook, and then told the sheriff that the disappearances were almost certainly the work of guerrillas crossing down from the Lamine Bottoms, and that the federal garrison had neither the men nor the orders to investigate civilian disappearances in an active war zone. Vaughn should go home and tend to the living. Reuben Vaughn left Pickering's office that afternoon with a cold feeling he could not put into words. 20 years later, on his deathbed in a small house outside St. Louis, he would try to explain that feeling to his grandson, and fail. The grandson wrote it down as well as he could remember. It was, the old man said, the feeling of speaking to a man who already knew the answer to every question you were asking him, and was waiting politely for you to stop asking them. The feeling of being measured like a pig at market by eyes that had already decided what price you were worth. In the weeks that followed, as the Missouri sky turned from hot September, blue to the flat pewter of October, and the first hard frosts came down from the north, 6 more families vanished from Blackwater County. The Corbins, 5 people, on October 11, taken from a cabin near the head of Sugar Creek. The Osgoods, 7 people, on October 17, taken from a fine 2-story clapboard house that had been the pride of the family for 3 generations, with a library of 40 books in the front room and a rosewood piano Mrs. Osgood had played every evening. The McCaskills, a family of 11 counting 2 hired hands, on October 24, taken from a big working farm with a dairy herd, still lowing in the barn the next morning, when a neighbor rode by and heard them. A family named Griswold, 4 people, on November 1. A family named Wagner, 6 people, on November 8. And finally, on the night of November 15, 1863, a family named Beaumont, 10 people, the largest household in the county, vanished from a cabin that stood less than 2 miles from the federal garrison itself. 9 households, 67 people, not one body, not one witness, not one shot fired. The community's response to this progression was not what later historians might expect. It was not outrage, not panic. It was something colder, more recognizable to anyone who has lived through a long and relentless wartime. The slow shrinkage of the human animal into itself, the pulling back of curtains, the locking of shutters, the quiet agreement among neighbors not to ride out after dark and not to ask too many questions in daylight. By the first week of November, people in Blackwater County had stopped visiting each other for supper. By the second week, they had stopped waving from their wagons when they passed on the road. The churches emptied. The general store in New Salisbury reported that women were sending their husbands to buy flour because they no longer wanted to leave the farms, even for an hour, even on a Saturday morning. On the farms themselves, families slept in shifts, one man or boy awake at all times with a loaded shotgun across his knees, watching the road, the tree line, and the backfield by the light of a single candle that burned low through the long October nights. But the thing the families could not protect themselves against was not the thing they were watching for. They were watching for bushwhackers, for strangers, for Quantrill's men galloping in their dreams. What they were not watching for was a polite knock at the door around 10 at night, a familiar face on the porch holding a lantern, a quiet voice speaking words that could almost be mistaken for kindness. Decades later, long after the war had ended, and the country had moved on to other nightmares, the empty farms of Blackwater County passed into a kind of regional folklore. Travelers coming through in the 1870s and 80s reported seeing lamps lit in windows of houses abandoned for 20 years. A journalist from the Kansas City Star riding through in 1891 wrote a short piece about the phenomenon, calling the region the County of Empty Tables, because, he said, every old homestead contained an empty table set for a meal nobody had lived to eat. Schoolchildren in New Salisbury, in the early 20th century, told each other stories about the Hollister cabin, still standing then in a corner of a cornfield, about the ghost of the little girl who had left her rag doll on the floor, about the sound of a spiral of apple peel unrolling in an empty room. But the folklore was wrong in one important respect. The tables had not been empty when the families left. They had been full, and whoever or whatever had taken those families had not done so in haste or fear. They had done so with a patience and completeness, suggesting something far worse than a bushwhacker raid. Somebody had come to those cabins, led those families out into the night one by one over 2 months, and made sure no trace was left behind. If this story is unsettling you as much as it unsettles me, take a moment to hit the like button and leave a comment with your theory about what happened in Blackwater County. I read every comment, and your ideas shape the stories I tell next. Now let us go back to the beginning and look at what Sheriff Reuben Vaughn began to find when he finally stopped trusting the federal garrison and started investigating on his own. The first thing the first thing Vaughn noticed once he laid the deeds of the 9 missing families out on the table in his small office at the county courthouse was that the farms were not random. He had assumed the bushwhackers had simply taken whichever families were easiest to reach. But when he plotted the 9 farms on a county map, using black pins borrowed from the tailor shop next door, a pattern emerged that was not random at all. The 9 farms formed a rough arc along the eastern bank of the Blackwater River, stretching some 11 miles from the northern county line down to the river landing in the south. They were among the best watered, best timbered, most productive parcels in the entire county. They sat astride the only natural corridor for any future railroad line that might be built from Boonville south toward the Ozarks. A corridor surveyed in 1959 from the Pacific Railroad and discussed in Norfolk Railroad and discussed in newspapers as a near certainty once the war ended and the national economy recovered. And they were all, without exception, adjacent to land acquired within the last 18 months by a single purchaser, a St. Louis land company called Pickering and Lamb Associates. Vaughn stared at that name for a long time. Pickering, the same surname as the federal captain at the garrison, and Lamb, the same surname as the second missing family, whose patriarch, old Calvin Lamb, had been one of the most vocal opponents of wartime land speculation, going to his neighbors in the summer of 1863 warning them not to sell their deeds to any agent of any St. Louis company under any circumstances. Old Calvin had been a fierce man, a veteran of the Black Hawk War, a man who carried his grievances in a small notebook in his breast pocket. He had given speeches on the courthouse steps in June and July about how the war was being used by men in St. Louis, Chicago, and Philadelphia to strip Western farmers of everything they had built. He had named names. He had pounded his fist on the courthouse porch rail until it shook. Calvin Lamb disappeared with his entire family on September 24. Vaughn rode to the county recorder's office the next morning and spent 6 hours working through the deed books. He found that Pickering and Lamb Associates had, between the spring of 1862 and the autumn of 1863, purchased 41 parcels of land in Blackwater County, all along the eastern bank of the Blackwater River, all within a mile of the 9 farms that had recently gone empty. The purchases had been made at remarkably low prices. In several cases, deeds had been signed over by widows whose husbands had been killed by guerrillas earlier that year and who needed cash quickly to feed their children through the coming winter. In other cases, sellers were listed as having relocated to Illinois or Iowa, though no forwarding addresses were recorded and nobody in the county seemed to know where they had gone. And in a few cases, most troublingly, the signatures on the deeds looked to Vaughan's careful eye to have been written in a hand very different from that, on other documents bearing the same names. Vaughn began cautiously asking questions. He rode out to the Wagner place, one of the missing farms, and searched the abandoned cabin with a care he had not used on his first visit. He looked behind cupboards, lifted trunk lids, went up into the loft, and pulled back the mattress ticking on each bed. Beneath a loose floorboard under the bed in the main room, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a strip of cotton, he found a small packet of letters. The letters were addressed to Samuel Wagner, the head of the missing family. They had been written over 4 months, between June and October 1863, and were signed by an agent of Pickering and Lamb Associates named Horace Osgood, the same surname as another missing family. Vaughn sat on the edge of Wagner's bed and read the letters in order by the slanted afternoon light coming through the cabin's single window. The letters were polite business correspondence on the surface. The first, dated June 8, introduced Mr. Osgood as a representative of a St. Louis firm interested in acquiring agricultural land in Blackwater County for post-war development, offering Samuel Wagner a fair market price for his 120 acres. The second, dated July 3, expressed polite disappointment at Wagner's refusal and raised the offer by 15%. The third, dated July 29, raised the offer again and mentioned that several neighbors had accepted similar offers and relocated with their families to new lands in central Iowa that the company had arranged to purchase on their behalf. The fourth, dated August 20, was different in tone. It mentioned by name Wagner's wife and children. Asked with apparent sympathy after young Elias Wagner, who had just begun his first year at county school, and observed that the countryside had become a very dangerous place for young families, and that a man with children bore responsibilities a childless man could not fully understand. The fifth, dated September 10, 6 days before the Hollister family vanished, spoke at length about the difficulty of protecting a rural family from depredations of bushwhackers and home guard alike, expressing hope that Wagner would reconsider before events overtook the matter. The sixth, dated October 4, contained a single sentence that made Reuben Vaughn sit down on the dusty floor and put his face in his hands. "We'll have arrangements, Mr. Wagner, that can provide for the safety of your family in exchange for your cooperation, and we would be grieved to see you refuse a kindness that others in your position have been grateful to accept." Others in your position. Vaughn rode back to town with the letters in his saddlebags. That night, in his small room above the dry goods store, he began to understand a version of what had happened, which turned out not to be the whole of it, though enough to get him killed. Some of the missing families, he reasoned, had been coerced, told bushwhackers or federal troops were coming, and offered safe passage out of the county in exchange for signing their deeds over to Pickering and Lamb Associates. They had left in the night, walking or riding with an escort, promised new land in Illinois or Iowa. Whether any made it was another question. But some, he believed, had walked out willingly, believing they were being saved. Perhaps the first 2 or 3 families had actually boarded a wagon, ridden to a distant depot, reached Iowa, received new land, because a scheme like this would have to begin honestly, sending the first few families through the machine so their letters back would confirm the story. So the next families would trust the offer. But somewhere along the way, the scheme changed. Somewhere along the way, the men running it realized they did not need to pay for new land in Iowa if they could simply make the families disappear and forge the deeds. Somewhere along the way, the cost of moving 67 people to another state exceeded the profit the land company was willing to accept, and the mathematics of the enterprise were adjusted. That was the meaning of the 4 words Vaughn would pin a month later to the inside cover of his ledger. They took them willing. The families had gone willing, led out by people they trusted or feared, believing in that first hour they were being rescued from something worse. And the worst part was that the people who led them out knew from the beginning where the road actually ended. But Vaughn did not yet know what happened after they left their cabins. Whether they were put on a train at some distant depot and sent to Iowa, or led to a quieter fate in the timber south of the river. He did not know which of his neighbors were part of the scheme and which were victims. He did not know who in the Pickering family was mastermind and who was errand boy. He knew none of these things yet, and he was about to make the mistake of trying to find out. On the morning of November 22, 1863, 1 week after the disappearance of the Beaumont family, Sheriff Reuben Vaughn rode to the federal garrison and requested a formal meeting with Captain Josiah Pickering. He brought a canvas satchel containing the Wagner letters, a copy of the deed records, and a list of 41 parcels he believed had been acquired by fraud, coercion, or worse. He intended to confront Pickering directly with the evidence and give him one chance, as a Union officer, to explain himself before Vaughn sent a copy to the provost marshal in Jefferson City. Pickering received him cordially, offered coffee, and listened without interrupting for 45 minutes while Vaughn laid out the evidence on the captain's desk, speaking in the steady, methodical voice of a lawman building his case in public. Pickering examined the deed records, read the Wagner letters slowly one by one, and when he finished, set the last letter down and looked up at Vaughn with a small, thoughtful expression on his thin face. He said, "Sheriff, I believe you have done a remarkable piece of work here. I am going to ask you to do one more thing before we proceed. I am going to ask you to wait here in this office for 1 hour while I send for a colleague of mine from the provost's office in Sedalia. He needs to hear this from you directly. Will you wait?" Reuben Vaughn, who had been sheriff in Missouri for 11 years and seen men lie in 100 different ways, looked at Captain Josiah Pickering across the desk and did not see a single sign of deceit. He knew it would come to this. He did not see a single sign of anything at all. Pickering's face was as smooth and empty as a plate. Vaughn said he would wait. Pickering rose, put on his coat, and walked out. What happened in the next 40 minutes is known only from a letter Vaughn wrote that same afternoon to his sister in St. Louis, mailed from a farmhouse 5 miles west of town, after riding out of the garrison through a side gate at a flat gallop with a Federal bullet through the crown of his hat. In the letter, Vaughn described hearing through the closed door of Pickering's office the captain's voice speaking quietly to a sergeant in the outer room, giving instructions that included the words "no trial," "river," and "tonight." He described understanding in a single cold moment what those 3 words meant together and what they had meant on 9 previous occasions. He described climbing out the office window, dropping into a narrow alley between garrison buildings, working his way through the stable yard crouched behind a water trough while a stable hand whistled a tune 2 feet away and did not see him, stealing a cavalry horse whose reins he cut with his pocket knife because he did not have time to untie them, and riding south through the timber with 2 troopers in pursuit, firing revolvers at his back. He described at the end his conviction that he was not going to live long. He asked his sister to keep the letter, and if anything happened to him, to take it to a particular lawyer in St. Louis, whose name he wrote in the margin. He closed with a single sentence she would repeat to anyone who asked about her brother's death. "I have seen a face that belongs to the worst man I have ever met. And the worst thing about it is that it is the face of a man who believes himself to be an officer and a gentleman and who has never for one moment doubted that he is." Just when you think this story could not get darker, the horror in Blackwater County intensifies. If this is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark American mysteries. Hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss another forgotten history. Now let us find out what Sheriff Reuben Vaughn discovered in the last month of his life, and what he hid, and where, so that someone eventually might find it. Vaughn did not ride to Jefferson City. He understood by the time he crossed the Lamine River the next morning that if the conspiracy reached as high as a federal captain, it probably reached higher, and the provost marshal's office was as likely to hang him as to hear him. Instead, he rode north into the timber country along the Missouri River and disappeared into a network of old friends, fellow Masons, and distant cousins stretching from Boonville to Glasgow. He spent the next 3 weeks living in barns and root cellars, moving every second night, never sleeping twice in the same place. He wrote in a small leather-bound notebook, kept inside his shirt, every scrap of information he could remember, and every piece of evidence he had gathered. The names of the 41 parcels, the dates of each transaction, the text of the Wagner letters reconstructed from memory, the words he had heard through Pickering's door. Then, in the first week of December, he did something nobody has ever fully understood. He rode back to Blackwater County, not to the county seat, not home, not to his own house where his wife still waited. unsure whether to mourn or keep his supper warm. He rode instead in the middle of the night to the farm of Asa Crenshaw, the old Methodist lay preacher who had discovered the empty Hollister cabin. Crenshaw took him in, fed him, and listened to his story for 4 hours by the light of a single tallow candle. When Vaughn had finished, Crenshaw sat in silence with his hands folded on the table and his eyes fixed on the flame. Then he said something Vaughn wrote down that same night. "I think I know where they are, Sheriff. I think I have known for some time. I think when I show you, you will understand why I have not spoken sooner. You will not, I think, find it in yourself to judge me too harshly, because I am an old man with a wife who cannot feed herself and 2 grandchildren in the back room. The knowledge of what I am about to show you is the kind of man in this country, in this year, cannot carry alone and live." The next morning, before dawn, the 2 men rode south along the Blackwater River to a place the old French voyagers called the Bend, where the river hooked sharply around a high limestone bluff, the current cutting a deep pool beneath the rock face. The pool was some 40 feet across and uncertain depth. Local children had been warned away, for as long as anyone remembered, because the current at the base of the bluff was treacherous, because the limestone above had a way of shedding slabs without warning, and because the older people said the pool did not give back what it took. 2 boys had drowned there in the 1840s, 1 in the 1850s. None of their bodies ever recovered. The river carried what it took, the saying went, all the way to the Gulf. Crenshaw dismounted at the edge of the bluff and led Vaughn down a narrow game trail to the water, barely wide enough for a horse, winding through scrub cedar and limestone shelves, emerging after perhaps 4 minutes onto a broad natural platform of pale rock some 12 feet above the pool. Halfway down, the trail passed a shelf where the limestone had been recently disturbed. Fresh scratches, showing where heavy stones had been rolled, the earth beneath softer than the surrounding ground, as though dug and refilled many times. Along the edge of the platform, where a person standing at the water's edge might pause before whatever came next, the rock face had been scored in a dozen places by marks that looked like boot nails and the drag of heavy heels. Crenshaw pointed to the shelf and said, "See it? I came down here in late September, Sheriff, looking for a lost calf, and I saw 2 men standing where we are standing now, rolling a stone into the pool. I hid in the brush above, where that cedar leans over the trail, and watched them. They were strong men, working in their shirt sleeves, and the stone they rolled was the size of a whiskey barrel, red, and it went into the water with a sound I have not been able to get out of my dreams since. When they finished and gone, I came down and looked at what was left on the ground. A child's shoe. A girl's shoe, brown leather with a small brass buckle. Ephraim Hollister's granddaughter's shoe. I had seen her wear it at the camp meeting in August. I picked it up, took it home, have it still hidden behind the loose board in my spring house, where my wife will not find it. I have not spoken of it in 3 months, because I have a wife and 2 grandchildren of my own, and a good Methodist knowledge of what this country has become. And I was afraid. God forgive me, Sheriff. I was afraid." Vaughn stood on the shelf and looked down at the dark water. He saw what happened. He did not speak for a long time. The morning mist lay on the pool in thin gray ribbons. A single crow called from the bluff above, and the water was so still Vaughn could see his own face, looking back from a great depth. Then he asked Crenshaw how many times he thought the stones had been rolled. Crenshaw could not be sure, but the disturbance of the earth suggested many separate occasions spread over the weeks the families had been disappearing. Perhaps 1 visit per family, perhaps 2 for the larger ones. Vaughn asked if Crenshaw had recognized the two men. Crenshaw said he had, and this was the hardest part. One was Horace Osgood, the land agent who wrote the Wagner letters. The other was a sergeant from the federal garrison, named Luther Pickering, the captain's cousin. Vaughn took out his notebook and wrote the two names down. Then they rode back to Crenshaw's farm in silence. That night in the preacher's barn, Vaughn copied every page of his notebook into a second, larger ledger Crenshaw had kept for his farm accounts and never filled more than halfway. He worked by the light of a single lantern hung from a nail in a beam, writing for 6 hours. When finished, he pinned to the inside cover a single sheet of paper, on which he wrote in a hand already beginning to shake from what he knew. 4 words. They took them willing. He did not mean by those words that the families had gone willing to their deaths. He meant they had gone willing out of their cabins believing they were being saved. And this was the worst part of the whole matter, because they had trusted the men who killed them, and the men who killed them had used that trust as the instrument of the killing. He meant that a betrayal of that depth was something American law, as he had practiced it for 11 years, had no adequate name for. He gave the ledger to Asa Crenshaw. He asked him to hide it, somewhere no one would find until the war ended and the country came to its senses. Crenshaw wrapped the ledger in double oilcloth, tied it with hemp cord, and buried it beneath the packed earth floor of his root cellar, in a corner behind barrels of smoked pork, under a stone marked on its underside with a small cross in candle suit. In the morning, Reuben Vaughn rode east toward Jefferson City for the second time, intending to reach the State House in person and place the original notebook and his own sworn testimony into the hands of the governor himself. He never arrived on December 19, 1863. His body was found in a creek bed some 40 miles east of Blackwater County, with 2 pistol balls in the back of his head. The official report listed the cause as murder by persons unknown, probably bushwhackers. His horse was never recovered. His saddlebags were empty. The notebook he had been carrying was gone. His widow received a brief letter of condolence from the provost marshal's office along with his watch, found in his vest pocket, and his wedding ring, cut from his finger, returned in a paper envelope without explanation. The county clerk, a man named Elijah Redfern, who had helped Vaughn compile the original ledger of missing families, heard of the sheriff's death on the morning of December 22. He spent that afternoon in his office at the courthouse, going through papers Vaughn had left in his desk drawer, and found enough to understand in outline what his friend had uncovered and what it had cost him. 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, Elijah Redfern took the coach to Sedalia. He rented a room at a boarding house on Ohio Avenue, wrote a summary of everything he knew in the margins of his personal copy of the county's missing persons register, pinned to the inside cover a sheet with the same 4 words Vaughn had given him. They took them willing, then walked to the apothecary on Main Street, purchased a bottle of laudanum, returned to his room, and drank the entire bottle before lying down with his hands folded over his chest. He was found by the boarding housekeeper the next morning, Christmas Day, 1863. The coroner ruled it accidental overdose from a medicine taken for nervous complaints. The ledger in his possession was returned unexamined to the clerk's office in New Salisbury, where it was placed in a locked cabinet by the acting clerk and forgotten. The ledger, buried beneath Asa Crenshaw's root cellar, remained where Crenshaw had put it. Crenshaw himself died of pneumonia in the winter of 1867, without telling anyone what lay beneath the cellar floor. He had intended several times to tell his son, tried once on a Sunday afternoon in the spring of '66, lost his nerve halfway through, and turned the conversation to corn planting. The farm was sold out of the family in 1872 after the son moved west to Kansas. The new owners tore down the old cabin and built another on a different part of the property. The root cellar gradually filled with dirt and rubble and was forgotten. In the spring of 1923, a young historian from the University of Missouri, named Ellsworth Hadley, working on a doctoral dissertation about the civilian cost of the Missouri guerrilla war, came to Blackwater County, looking for primary sources. He spent 3 weeks interviewing elderly residents in their parlors and porches, patiently drawing out stories their parents and grandparents had told them, and they had never thought to write down. In those interviews, he heard from the granddaughter of Asa Crenshaw a story her grandmother had whispered on her deathbed about a sheriff who came to the farm one night in the winter of '63 and left something important buried in the old root cellar before riding east to die. The granddaughter had not known whether to believe it. Her grandmother had been 90, one and in and out of her senses. But she repeated it to the young historian because he was polite and genuinely interested, and she had nobody else to tell. Hadley got permission from the current owner to dig. On the afternoon of April 11, 1923, in a drizzling spring rain that turned the earth to cold clay under his hands, he unearthed a rotted oilcloth packet. Inside, remarkably preserved, was Reuben Vaughan's second ledger. Hadley spent 6 months transcribing and verifying the contents. He rowed out to the bend and stood on the platform above the pool, looking into the dark water. He cross-referenced deed records. He tracked down what had become of Pickering and Lamb Associates. He found in the St. Louis probate court the will of Horace Osgood, who died a wealthy man in 1891, whose estate at the time included controlling interests in 4 Missouri banks, a St. Louis hotel, and some 13,000 acres along the Blackwater and Lamine rivers, including every one of the 41 parcels acquired by the land company during the war. He found that Captain Josiah Pickering, at the war's end, had been promoted to major, resigned his commission honorably in 1866, returned to Illinois, become a state senator, and died in his bed in 1904, widely mourned. He found that Luther Pickering had been killed in a saloon brawl in Kansas City in 1871, carrying a silver pocket watch engraved E.H., which Hadley believed, though could not prove, had belonged to Ephraim Hollister. And he found, most painfully, that the railroad line surveyed in 1859 had indeed been built in the 1880s, running directly along the corridor defined by the 41 parcels, and the sale of those parcels to the railroad in 1883 had made the heirs of Horace Osgood and Josiah Pickering richer in a single transaction than any of the 9 families killed for them could have imagined in 20 lifetimes of honest work. Hadley submitted his findings, along with the ledger, to the Missouri Historical Society in the autumn of 1923. The board of directors reviewed the material and voted 5-2 to decline publication. The minutes, eventually declassified in the 1960s, indicate the majority believed the evidence strong, but that descendants of several families named in the ledger were prominent citizens of St. Louis and Chicago, and publication would cause, in the chairman's words, a degree of distress disproportionate to the public interest at this removal of time. The ledger was placed in the Society's closed archives. Hadley's dissertation, under pressure from his department chair, was rewritten to focus on less controversial aspects of the Missouri War. Hadley, a deeply disappointed man who had spent his own money pursuing the investigation, took a teaching position at a small college in Indiana and published nothing further. He died in 1941, leaving a box of private papers his wife donated to his alma mater, where they sat unread in a basement storage room for another 40 years. The ledger was finally read by outside researchers in 1967, When the Missouri Historical Society opened its closed archives for the state's Civil War centennial, 2 articles were written. One in a regional historical journal with readership of perhaps 400 specialists. The other in the Sunday supplement of a Kansas City newspaper, read by a few thousand people for a few days and then forgotten. The descendants of the Pickering and Osgood families, scattered across 4 states and several generations, were never publicly named. No criminal investigation was ever opened, because the statute of limitations on murder in Missouri, though technically unlimited, is functionally meaningless when every person involved has been dead half a century and every physical piece of evidence lies under 40 feet of river water. This mystery shows us something American history has always been uncomfortable saying out loud in the chaos of a great war. Some people do not become heroes and some do not become villains. But some, quietly in the shadow of real violence, use its cover to do small and terrible things for money. Those small and terrible things can remain hidden for 100 years, because everyone involved has a reason to look the other way. The families of Blackwater County did not vanish. They were taken one by men they knew, who told them lies they wanted to believe. They were walked down a narrow trail to a pool beneath a limestone bluff, and the river carried the evidence away. Their land was bought for pennies. Their descendants, the ones sent away as small children in the scheme's first months, before the killings began, grew up elsewhere under new names and never knew. Their houses stood empty until plows finally broke them down. Fields grew over, the railroad came, stations were built, towns along the line prospered. And the children of the men who did the killing went to good schools, served in legislatures, were buried under marble monuments in cemeteries far from the pool beneath the bluff. The 4 words Sheriff Reuben Vaughn pinned to the inside cover of his ledger in the last week of his life remain perhaps the truest ever written about that season in that county. They took them willing, because the deepest horror of Blackwater County was not the killing. It was the trust that made the killing possible. It was the polite knock at the door after dark. It was the familiar face on the porch holding a lantern. It was the quiet voice saying, "Get the children dressed. It is not safe here anymore. Come with me, and I will take you somewhere you will be safe." It was the willingness of the human heart to believe the worst thing cannot happen to it, because the person telling the lie is somebody it has known all its life. And it is the knowledge carried home by every one of those 67 people in the last 10 minutes of their lives. As the trail narrowed, the limestone platform came into view, and the men in the shadows stepped forward with the stones already prepared. That they had been wrong. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Or are there still families out there, descended from survivors, who carry fragments of the truth, without knowing what they mean? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more forgotten American histories, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who believes, as I do, that the past is never really past, and the things we bury always eventually come back up. I will see you in the next video.